Welcome to the Aries Technology Guide to creating elevated photographic prints. For this video, we'll center on how to create a custom elevation file that is precisely registered to the original photograph. We will cover the source color photo, the generation of a gray tone elevation image, the point cloud preview to see the effect of our work in progress, and the final effect in the elevation print. Before we get too deep into the process, it's important to review the issue of walls. Unwanted walls are an issue which arise with high contrast images, or rather, high contrast grayscale images. We'll start with an example image to illustrate a base of knowledge. So what we have here is a very basic color image, the color layer. What we need to do is create an elevation grayscale file to elevate these strokes here. The first step is to just simply turn the image grayscale. So there we go. Gray tones in light and dark, but we don't have a full black and a full white. For the Aries print process, we need to have a full black and full white pixel somewhere in every elevation image, no matter the final elevation. At this point, we don't have those here. We do have strokes higher than the background. We've done that. And the elevation here will be higher than this area here, which is also higher than this area here. So let's just change the contrast. And now we have full black, full white. But we don't have an even level of height on the whole stroke. But if we want these two strokes to have even height, then we need to edit this tone. The source color image is a good starting point to make a selection for an edit. With these two black strokes now generated, we have a full darkness down the whole stroke, and therefore at the same elevation. But there's still one more issue. The softness of this stroke will produce a smooth blend up from the base layer of the substrate to the highest point of that stroke. But here we have very high contrast from black to white. There's a very small amount of change over just a few pixels, and this creates what we refer to as walls. Here's a cross-section. This line here is our cross-section, and this is the end-on view. So what we have is elevation up from the base, and this volume inside this stroke here, and over here as well. This one is gradated. It's going up from white to black on a gradient slope. Over here, it's a very sharp change in height. The high point and low point between the two of them is very little distance across the horizontal plane. This will create these walls here, along the high contrast transition edge. Let's look at this in 3D. Here's the cross-section elevation from this two-dimensional image, the grayscale TIFF image, derived purely from the linear application of ink onto the surface. So here, with the pale gray tone, we get a low elevation, and here, with the black, we get the highest. Between the two is a very shallow gradation, very high contrast gradation, and with that, we're just creating this wall here. From the side, you really see the dark wall. There's a bit of color in the transition point at the top, where this gradation begins to flatten out again to black. But from a top-down view, the printer is doing a brilliant job of laying down the color in a linear direction from a two-dimensional perspective. But we're dealing with a 3D surface, so it's not going to hit this vertical wall here. That's the issue we're dealing with, and what we want to avoid by softening the contrast in the grayscale and elevation image. Softening like this will eliminate any possibility of a wall. The gradient here is smooth over a generous number of pixels, and the result is a smooth blend and no wall. As with any photograph, the final intent is the story, or the message inherent in the image, and this is open to interpretation. Other ideas and designs can always be added throughout the process to impart a new narrative or accentuate what's visible. However, we're going to start with the base fundamentals. For this first example, we'll create an elevation file that follows the literal interpretation of the photograph. At first glance, this seems like quite a complex task to bring elevation into this because there's so many little pieces of glass and reflections and refractions, not to mention the tire tread. Here's the layers needed for this elevation. It looks complex, but it's based on very simple principles. Tone gradations, masked, and effects layers applied in combination. But the grayscale image itself gives us much of what we need. When the photo was taken, choices were made for composition of foreground, background, and subject, but with an elevated print there is an opportunity to reinforce or adjust this later. With that in mind, we need to determine what the dominant elevated subjects are in order to determine the high point, in this case the tire. In the majority of cases, the grayscale version of the photograph will be used, at least in part, in the elevation image. We can't use the tire part of the original photograph, as it has these painted areas that are lighter in luminance than the dark tire, creating a high point, low point, high point effect, which will create canyons in the elevated surface that we don't want. What we're aiming for is the smooth surface of the rubber tire with just the tread pattern cut into the print, looking like a little canyon of tire tread right there, all the way down into perspective there. Some of the small glass fragments stand out above the clutter as well. What we want is dark glass shards surrounded by light tones, but we have the opposite due to these current gray tones. The simplest technique, invert the grayscale. Now these glass fragments are darker and areas around each lighter. To reduce dominance of these small dark areas in elevation, we'll shift the dark tone lighter in order for larger fragments to rise in dominance. There's a dark tone here on this glass, which is nice and high. It's black. But down here on this transparent glass, we're seeing through, in logical terms, seeing through the glass to the material behind the sheet of glass. Just in terms of the pixel colors and what we're getting in the image is this mottled effect. We can't really use that for elevation because we know there's a smooth sheet of glass there. The same applies to this lighter tone sheet too. And this is receding in perspective here. So what we need is to have this point here be the high point, receding back to this low point back here. So these larger sections will be replaced with a dark to light gradation. These are also examples of the wall effect, as this dark is changing to a lighter tone over too short a number of pixels. So no matter what, this would need attention anyway. At this point, a blur to the image will remove the noise and the small details for this base level of elevation. High levels of very small elevation detail can cause loss of color application in the accurate surface of a print. These sorts of details are built upon a larger base. We need to look at these large areas of tone that define the main subject. Working forward in perspective will reinforce the illusion of photographic depth by lowering these soft focus background details with a large white gradient. We need to replace the gray tones of the tire with bulk layers of gradation from dark to light around this bend, over the top, and the inside rim. Each gradient, when masked to different areas of the subject, can quickly build up a three-dimensional organic shape, just in terms of blocking in the base shape. Using layer effects like outer or inner glows is also a good way to blend multiple elements together. This is what we're aiming towards. The goal of all these techniques is the even gradient with suggestions of fine details. Along the face of this tire surface, it's smooth with a tread pattern cut in. I trace the pattern from the color layer, applying it on top of the base with a soft edge mask. The paint from the photograph is now gone, so just the tread is cutting into the print surface. Taking parts of the photograph of the tire and applying it on the top of this upper area gives us the fine details. Here on these various shards of glass, we have created new gradations, high point and low point, and here in high point and low point and smooth gradations. This is your foundation or base, if you will. The effect here of that transparent glass is there in the photograph, and that effect will be printed on top of the base layer. So this tone here will not affect the colors, but it will affect the elevated location of where the color is applied. To see how the effect is progressing, we can save out two 16-bit TIFFs and generate a point cloud preview with the help of the Arius image to point cloud converter. View the preview in an app like Cloud Compare and iterate until you're confident the effect is working and any wall issues are solved. Here's the final print with a total elevation of 5 millimeters at the highest point. Study the effects you're seeing here and the gray values and how they compare to gauge how and where to elevate your photograph.